Welcome back for our third mini lecture on opioids. We're going to start this one by talking about the mechanism of action for opioids. And this all starts with our endogenous opioids, or naturally occurring opioid-like transmitters. These include neurotransmitters that are found in the brain and adrenals, and also in the pituitary gland. It includes endorphins, if you're familiar with those. They're the ones that are typically associated with the idea of the runner's high, that feeling of pleasure that we talked about for the use of opioids. If you think about how that's related, it can start to help you build those connections. Basically, we know that the opioids in our body and opioid drugs are agonists of several types of opioid receptors. So we've got a few that play a role in pain reception, but in general, this whole relationship is one that we don't understand very well. So in terms of the mechanism of action here, we still have a lot to learn. Now, an opioid antagonist, this is a drug that blocks the action of opioids. These include naloxone and, or more commonly known as Narcan, and nalorphine. Basically, when someone is in danger of dying from an opioid overdose, what we're typically looking at is severely depressed respiration. So the person's on the verge of not breathing anymore because of the severely depressing effects on their respiratory system. So if a person receives an opioid antagonist at this time, it can cause an abrupt withdrawal syndrome, and it blocks the continued effects of that opioid. It can have some very immediate effects. We can see people who look like they were on the verge of death actually be quite rapidly resuscitated. Now, if these are used on a more regular basis, they can actually keep people who are dependent on opioids from experiencing the high that's associated with opioid use. So we do see some interest in using these tools for a harm reduction strategy. So if we distribute naloxone to heroin users, then we do see fewer people who die of overdoses. So we talked earlier in the semester about harm reduction. This is one of the ways that we can see that tool used among those who are dependent on opioids. Now keep in mind, we do have some very beneficial uses of opioids. It is one of our most effective tools to reduce pain. So it works in several ways. First of all, it reduces the emotional response to pain. I've heard this described as there's two different parts to this. If you are experiencing extreme pain, there's the actual neural stimulus, but then there's the suffering that goes along with it, the emotional response. So opioids will reduce that emotional response, as well as our awareness of and the response to the actual neural stimulus. Typically, opioids will make you drowsy, but they don't work to induce sleep the way our sedative hypnotics would. We've also seen it used for the treatment of intestinal disorders. It does counteract diarrhea. We do know that consistent use of opioids can lead to constipation, but for those who need that effect because of extreme diarrhea and the resulting dehydration, we can see opioids help to address that. And of course, we also see opioids used as cough suppressants. And particularly here, we're talking about codeine, which has been used as a cough suppressant for centuries. And if you've ever taken an over-the-counter cough suppressant, you've taken an opioid analog, commonly included in over-the-counter cough suppressants. So we do have to consider when we talk about opioids and opioid abuse, prescription opioid abuse, that we do actually have beneficial uses for these products as well. When we look at the dependence potential for opioids, we have two different things that we need to consider. We first got tolerance and then physical dependence. So remember, tolerance is where our body builds up the ability to metabolize the drug or to moderate its effects. And we do see tolerance develop to most of the effects of opioids, which means that then the user needs to take higher doses to maintain the effects. And also cross-tolerance. So we can't switch you from one opioid to another for pain relief and see that tolerance of its pain-relieving effects addressed. We really just do need to increase the dose to continue to address the issues of suffering and pain in a person who might be taking it for those reasons. And then we've got physical dependence, which of course we define as the presence of withdrawal symptoms. So opioid withdrawal does occur. It's unpleasant, but rarely life-threatening. And actually, we can prevent those withdrawal symptoms with any of the opioid agonists that we discussed when we talked about harm reduction. So when we look at what opioid withdrawal symptoms actually occur, we've got the craving for the drug and the anxiety. And then some yawning, perspiration, runny nose. So again, things that are not life-threatening, unpleasant, but not life-threatening. About 16 hours since the last dose, we'd see an increase in that, plus dilation of the pupils, goosebumps, hot and cold flashes, aches, loss of appetite. About 24 to 36 hours out from the last dose, all of that becomes more intense, plus insomnia, increased blood pressure, increased temperature and pulse rate. And then 36 to 48 hours, we see again increased intensity, vomiting, diarrhea, weight loss, and increased blood sugar. Now, if we can get the person past that 36 to 48 hours, then we see those withdrawal symptoms begin to decrease. But what we typically see with opioids is the psychological dependence. And one of the reasons that we see that develop is because of that positive reinforcement. Somebody gets the craving for the drug, they take the drug, and they see its positive effects pretty rapidly. And they also get negative reinforcement where the use of the drug removes those withdrawal symptoms that we just listed. Now, injectable opioids, because of their fast action, are the ones that are most likely to lead to dependence. So moving on now to toxicity, we've got both acute and chronic toxicity concerns with opioid users. For acute toxicity, we've got that suppressed respiration that we talked about, and especially in combination with alcohol. We do occasionally see nausea and vomiting with the use of opioids, and all of these can be countered with a dose of naloxone. Now, in terms of chronic toxicity, most of what we see here is associated with the injectable forms of the drug because it is most closely associated with the physical process of injection. Typically here, what we're worried about are infections at the injection site, as well as the spread of diseases caused by bloodborne pathogens. We talked about harm reduction recently, a few slides ago. Another method of harm reduction that we can see with opioid users is the distribution of clean needles or needle exchanges. If we can't solve the problems that would lead to opioid dependence, at least we can prevent the spread of bloodborne diseases in the population that's using injectable drugs. So different ways that harm reduction can be used with this population. If we look at what it actually looks like to be a heroin user, so we're here specifically talking about heroin. The folks who are dependent on heroin need 3 to 4 injections every day to prevent withdrawal. It is a very expensive habit. The cost of the drug itself remains quite high, and it can be difficult to determine what the size of that injection should actually look like. So we've also got different purity in different batches, and they've got the risk of those skin infections and bloodborne infections. And because of these challenges, we do see people who are able to gradually stop using the drug. Some of the things that tend to be said about the use of heroin that are not necessarily true is these feelings of intense pleasure that are unequal to anything else. Actually, there are quite a few people who report that nausea and vomiting with the use of opioids. And then, of course, the process of building up tolerance, that builds more rapidly compared to the feeling of euphoria. When we look at opioid withdrawal, this is not something that is always as excruciating as it's made out to be in popular media. Typically, we went through the list of symptoms and their length. A mild case of the flu or the stomach bug might be a better comparison. And then we also have this misconception that after you inject one time that you're hooked for life. And we see this as actually based in fact. We do see about 1 million people in the United States who are dependent, and that actually takes some effort to get there. There are about 2 to 3 times more people who are actually occasional users of the drug. So that will wrap us up with our lecture, here on opioids today. Thanks for your time, and I will see you for our next lecture.